Coming on the air because music legend Dolly Parton is dead at the age of 80. She was one of the most unifying forces in American culture, a celebrity for more than 50 years.
On the morning of August 25, 2026, a message went out from Nashville, Tennessee that stopped the world in its tracks. Dolly Parton, one of the most beloved entertainers America has ever produced, had died at the age of 80. The news came from her nephew, Brian Seaver, who delivered it on behalf of the Parton and Owens families in a video that was as gentle and as heartbreaking as anything the singer herself might have written. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from every corner of the entertainment world, from country music royalty to Hollywood stars to ordinary fans who had grown up with her songs playing in the background of their lives. But behind the tributes, behind the sea of rhinestones and remembrance, there was a quieter story unfolding. It was the story of a woman who had spent her final 2 years fighting battles she rarely let the public see, battles that began the moment she lost the person she loved most in the world. To understand how Dolly Parton's story ended, you first have to understand how it began, because very few entertainers have traveled as far, or carried as much, as she did. She was born on January 19, 1946, in a one-room cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children. There was no electricity in that cabin. There was no running water. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, worked the land and later took on construction jobs to keep his enormous family fed, and though he never learned to read or write, Dolly would spend the rest of her life describing him as one of the smartest people she ever knew. Her mother, Avi Lee, filled the house with old mountain ballads and hymns, and it was there, surrounded by poverty but never silence, that young Dolly began to find her voice. She was writing songs before she was old enough to understand what a career even was. By 5, she had already composed her first tune. By 8, she had her first real guitar. By 10, she was singing on local radio and television in Knoxville. And at just 13 years old, she stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, introduced by Johnny Cash himself, a moment that would have been the highlight of most careers but for Dolly was simply the first step. The day after she graduated high school, in 1964, she boarded a bus to Nashville with nothing but ambition and talent to her name. She was the first person in her family to finish high school, and she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Nashville in the 1960s was not an easy place for a young woman trying to break into country music on her own terms, but Dolly refused to be shaped into someone else's idea of what a female singer should be. Her partnership with Porter Wagoner in 1967 gave her the national platform she needed, and by the early 1970s, she was no longer just a singer performing other people's songs. She was a songwriter whose words would outlive her by generations. In 1972 alone, she wrote both Jolene and I Will Always Love You, two songs that remain, more than 50 years later, among the most covered and most beloved in American music history. From there, her reach only grew. She conquered Hollywood alongside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin in 9 to 5 in 1980. A film that became a massive box office success and gave her yet another era-defining hit with its title song. She built Dollywood in the heart of the region where she had once gone without electricity, turning her fame into an economic engine for the community that raised her. And in 1995, she launched what she would later call her proudest achievement, the Imagination Library, a program that mailed free books to children around the world, partly inspired by her father's inability to read. By the time of her death, that program had given away hundreds of millions of books to children across multiple countries. Even her business instincts set her apart from almost every other performer of her generation. Where many entertainers simply licensed their name to outside companies, Dolly insisted on being a genuine partner in Dollywood, shaping the rides, the shows, and the atmosphere of the park herself. She wanted visitors to leave feeling like they had spent the day with family, not just at an amusement park, and that philosophy extended into everything she touched. She launched a record label, a production company, restaurants, and eventually a line of products that all carried her name, but none of it ever felt like a celebrity cashing in. It felt, instead, like an extension of the same woman who used to sew her own clothes out of feed sacks because there was nothing else available. Her songwriting, too, deserves its own place in the story, because it is easy to focus on her personality and forget just how prolific she was as a writer. Over the decades, she wrote thousands of songs, many of which she never recorded herself, instead giving them away to other artists who turned them into hits of their own. She wrote across genres almost effortlessly, moving from traditional country ballads to gospel, from bluegrass to pop crossover, without ever losing the plain-spoken honesty that defined her earliest work. Awards followed naturally from that body of work, but Dolly always insisted that the writing itself, not the trophies, was what mattered most to her. She once said that a song was really finished the moment someone else heard themselves in it, and that idea guided her entire catalog. But none of that explains who Dolly Parton really was behind closed doors, and to understand her final years, you have to understand the one relationship that mattered more to her than any award, any album, or any business empire she built. That relationship was with a man named Carl Dean. They met outside a Nashville laundromat on the very same day she arrived in the city in 1964. She was 18. He was 21. Carl had no interest in show business, no desire for fame, and as it turned out, that was exactly what made their marriage work. They married quietly in 1966 in a small Baptist church in Georgia, away from cameras and away from the industry pressure that surrounded her. For nearly 60 years, Carl remained almost entirely out of the public eye, running his own asphalt paving business and steering clear of the red carpets and award shows that defined his wife's life. While Dolly became one of the most photographed women on earth, Carl became, by choice, one of the least. That balance, she said many times over the decades, was part of what kept them together for so long. She could be Dolly Parton everywhere else. At home, she was simply his wife. In 2016, they renewed their vows to mark 50 years of marriage, a milestone that felt almost unthinkable in an industry where relationships rarely survive that kind of scrutiny and distance. But a few years later, Carl's health began to decline, and Dolly, true to her nature, poured herself into caring for him. She stepped back from parts of her public schedule. She stayed close to home. She later admitted that during this period, she stopped paying attention to her own body because all of her attention was focused on his. Carl Dean died on March 3, 2025, in Nashville. He was 82 years old. For Dolly, it was a loss unlike anything else she had experienced in her long and eventful life. There was no version of her adulthood that didn't include him somewhere in it. He had known her before the wigs and the rhinestones, before the platinum records and the film premieres, before the world decided she was an icon. He had simply known her. In the months that followed, Dolly spoke publicly, if only occasionally, about how hard it was to keep working. She dedicated a song, If You Hadn't Been There, to Carl, and admitted in interviews that she was struggling to write new music because the grief was still too close. For a woman whose entire life had been built on turning pain into song, the silence that followed Carl's death was its own kind of heartbreak. And it was in the middle of that grief, while she was still adjusting to a life without the man she had loved for nearly 6 decades, that her own health began to unravel. The first public sign came in the fall of 2025, when Dolly postponed a highly anticipated residency at the Coliseum at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, citing health challenges. Fans were concerned, but the postponement was framed as temporary, a chance for her to rest and return stronger. The shows were rescheduled for September 2026. That rescheduling never came to pass. In May 2026, Dolly announced she was canceling the Las Vegas dates altogether, explaining that while she was responding to treatment, she simply wasn't strong enough yet to handle the physical demands of a live show. Behind that announcement was a growing list of medical problems that Dolly, true to form, tried to manage quietly. She dealt with recurring kidney stones and infections. She described her immune and digestive systems as being affected, leaving her feeling, in her own words, completely out of balance. It was a slow, grinding kind of illness rather than a single dramatic event, the sort of thing that wears a person down gradually rather than all at once. Even as her body struggled, her mind never stopped working. Those close to her said she remained involved in plans for a new museum in Nashville, continued developing a Broadway musical based on her life, and was exploring new technology that could preserve her music and likeness for future generations. It was, in many ways, classic Dolly. Even while fighting to hold on to her health, she was still thinking about legacy, about what she could leave behind for the people who loved her. In October 2025, a moment of genuine panic swept through her fan base when her sister, Frida Parton, posted publicly asking people to pray for Dolly. The message spread quickly, and within hours, rumors were circulating that Dolly had died or was gravely ill. Dolly responded herself, appearing in a video to reassure fans that she was very much alive, though clearly dealing with something serious enough to prompt her sister's plea. It was an early glimpse of just how fragile her health had become, even if the full picture wasn't yet public. By the summer of 2026, the warning signs were harder to explain away. In early August, Dolly missed a scheduled appearance connected to Dollywood after experiencing dizziness and dehydration. In her usual warm, self-deprecating style, she told fans that her doctor had clipped her wings and ordered her not to travel that week. It was a small moment, framed with humor, the kind of thing she had done her entire career to make hard news feel a little lighter. But it was also a signal that her body was no longer cooperating with the schedule she had kept for over 60 years. Then, on August 21, 2026, Dolly gave what would turn out to be her final public update on her health. She acknowledged, openly and without her usual deflection, that she had health issues she hadn't properly addressed while she was focused on caring for Carl. She spoke about ongoing projects, about the future, about getting better. There was no indication, not from her words and not from the tone in which she said them, that she believed her time was running short. 4 days later, everything changed. Dolly was admitted to a hospital in Nashville. Her family kept the details private, choosing not to share the specifics of her condition with the public. And on Tuesday, August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton passed away. Her family described her death as peaceful. Her representatives later confirmed that the cause was cancer, following what her publicist described as a brief battle with the disease. The exact type of cancer and the details of her treatment were never fully disclosed, and her family made clear they intended to keep it that way, choosing privacy over public explanation even in their final statement about her. It's worth pausing on that choice, because it says something about who Dolly was. For a woman who spent decades turning her personal life into material for songs, jokes, and interviews, who joked openly about her wigs, her plastic surgery, and her backwoods Barbie persona, there was still a line she and her family chose not to cross. The specifics of her illness remained hers, and hers alone, right up until the end. What the world was left with instead was everything she built along the way. Dolly sold more than 100 million records over the course of her career. She became a member of both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She won a staggering number of Grammy Awards. She crossed from country music into pop culture, into film, into philanthropy, into business, doing at each stage what very few entertainers ever manage, reinventing herself without ever losing the audience that loved her in the first place. But if you ask the people who actually knew her, the number that mattered most wasn't a record sale or an award. It was the number of books given away through the Imagination Library, which by the time of her death had reached hundreds of millions of children across multiple countries. It was the number of young performers who cited her as the reason they picked up a guitar. It was the number of people, famous and unknown alike, who felt like they had lost a family member on the day she died, even though most of them had never met her. In the days after her death, tributes came from every direction imaginable. Musicians who grew up on her songs spoke about what her voice had meant to them. Actors who had shared the screen with her remembered her warmth off camera as much as her talent on it. Politicians from opposing sides of the aisle, a rarity in itself, found common ground in praising a woman who somehow managed to remain beloved across every divide American culture could produce. That, more than any statistic, may be the truest measure of what she built over 60 years. A kind of universal affection that very few public figures ever achieve and even fewer manage to hold on to until the very end. Fans gathered outside Dollywood and at makeshift memorials across Tennessee, many of them holding handwritten signs quoting her lyrics back to her one last time. Radio stations across the country dedicated entire days to playing nothing but her catalog, and streaming platforms reported a surge in listeners revisiting songs some of them hadn't heard in decades. It wasn't only the classics that resurfaced. Younger listeners, many of whom had only known her through more recent collaborations or through clips shared online, found themselves discovering the depth of her earlier work for the first time. Songs about poverty, faith, heartbreak, and resilience that suddenly felt as relevant as they had 50 years earlier. What struck so many people in those days wasn't just the scale of her career, but how personally so many strangers felt her loss. Teachers wrote about students who had grown up receiving Imagination Library books in the mail every month. Nurses and caregivers spoke about playing her music for patients who found comfort in her voice during difficult treatments. Small business owners in Sevier County, where Dollywood remains one of the region's largest employers, talked about a woman who never forgot where she came from, who reinvested in the community that raised her instead of leaving it behind once she found success elsewhere. It was, in many ways, a rare kind of legacy, one built as much on generosity and consistency as on talent. Even in death, Dolly seemed determined to make sure the story didn't end with sadness alone. Friends close to the family noted that in the years before she passed, She had already been thinking about how she wanted to be remembered, quietly working on projects meant to outlast her, from the ongoing development of her Nashville hotel and museum to plans that would keep her music and image available to future generations. She had spent her whole career preparing for the moment she wouldn't be around to perform herself, not out of fear, but out of the same practical instinct that had guided every business decision she ever made. She wanted the work to continue, even when she couldn't. Her final 2 years, though, tell a different and more human story than the highlight reel of her career ever could. They tell the story of a woman who spent nearly 6 decades loving one man quietly and then had to learn, in her final chapter, how to live and how to grieve without him. They tell the story of someone who kept working through illness not because she needed the money or the attention, but because working was how she had always processed the world, and silence, even in grief, was never really her language. And they tell the story of a family that, in the end, chose to protect her privacy even as the world clamored for details, honoring the same instinct she had shown her entire life, to give the public everything she had to offer, except the parts that were truly hers alone. Dolly Parton did not go quietly into her final years. She postponed shows, canceled residencies, and admitted, in her own words, that her body was failing her, but she kept planning museums, kept developing musicals, and kept talking about the future almost until the very end. She lost her husband, then buried her grief in work, then finally, after months of hiding just how much pain she was carrying, ran out of road. She was 80 years old. She left behind an empire built from nothing, a catalog of songs that will likely outlive everyone reading this, and a family that loved her not for what she achieved, but for who she was when the cameras were finally off. In the end, that may be the most fitting tribute of all, a woman who spent her whole life turning hardship into something beautiful, right up until the very last chapter she never got the chance to write.